Hello and welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. Today we're going to look at Rhipsalis floccosa, subspecies Tucumanensis. Rhipsalis floccosa is a little bit confusing. The reason why it's so confusing is because there are 5 different subspecies, and that might depend on whose taxonomy you go by. So I think more recently, 5 subspecies have been recognized. So Rhipsalis floccosa, subspecies Floccosa, Rhipsalis floccosa, subspecies Tucumanensis, Rhipsalis floccosa, subspecies Palving-ingera, Rhipsalis floccosa, subspecies Oreophylla, and Rhipsalis floccosa, subspecies Hohenauensis. Some of them are very easy to recognize because they have colored flowers or colors on their flowers. And actually, there are some Rhipsalis floccosa subspecies Tucumanensis that have kind of a rosy pink coloration on the backsides of their petals or on the tips of their petals. I think that one of the kind of confusing things about Tucumanensis specifically is that may or may not be present. And oddly enough, I have 2 that are supposed to be Tucumanensis. One of them has kind of smaller, a little bit more pinkish berries, and then this one has gigantic berries, which Tucumanensis was described as having berries that were quite large. So that's the reason why we can only assume that this is Tucumanensis. But any which way, it is definitely Rhipsalis floccosa. Before I forget, there was at one time a 6th subspecies, but that is no longer recognized as a subspecies. That has been classified as its own species now. So Rhipsalis Pittieri is just its own species. Even though it kind of looks similar, if in person, if you saw the flower, you would understand why it's its own species. And the reason why we're filming like this, which seems a little bit strange, is we're actually in the Rhipsalis closet. And one of the things that I find very difficult about Rhipsalis when they get big like this is actually really hard to film them in all their glory. And this is a beautiful, beautiful plant. I absolutely love this plant. And I feel like Rhipsalis floccosa is just sort of underappreciated. I don't really feel like very many people grow it. And I really cannot quite figure out why. I don't know if it's because people don't like it. I don't know if it's because people can't find it. I don't know if people do grow it and they just don't know that it's Rhipsalis floccosa. Because I think more often than not, I don't see Rhipsalis floccosa being misidentified as other things. I actually see more other things being misidentified as Rhipsalis floccosa. Really commonly, I think I see Rhipsalis Nevis armandii, form Nevis armandii, and form Megalantha being misidentified as Rhipsalis floccosa. And it's kind of a shame, but one of the things that's really fun about Rhipsalis floccosa, of course, is its name. So floccosa, floccose, meaning like woolly, and when it blooms, and sometimes even when it doesn't bloom, it has wool that's actually immersed inside of the areole behind the ovary. And so when it blooms and the flower starts to form, wool kind of gets exposed because it pushes its way out of the areole with the bloom. You can kind of see these little tufts of wool here that are around the ovaries. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, I think it's really, really interesting, but all of them do that. And literally all of these subspecies, they do look similar. They're all recognizable as being Rhipsalis floccosa. They just have very small differences in their flower, small differences in like the width of their branches, but they all kind of grow the same. So they all generally have this determinate kind of branching. These will only get about this long before they start a new branch. They almost always form out of the ends of the last branch, and they might form 3, 2, 1. The only times that I typically see the new branch segments form out of a different place other than the end of the old branch segments is if the tip of a branch segment has been damaged in some way. Then it might actually start forming a little bit higher up. Otherwise, it has a very typical Rhipsalis form. There are places on this plant, like right here, where you can see that the tip of this was damaged. You can see it was cut or something, and then you can see branches that had formed a little bit further back from the tip. One thing that I will say about Rhipsalis floccosa, and this may or may not depend on how you fertilize and stuff, but I do not bloom fertilize the plant, so I don't try to give them like a huge bloom booster and get it to have this gigantic flush of blooms all at the same time. I don't typically do that kind of thing. I just let them bloom whenever they're going to bloom, whenever they are capable of blooming. What I see with Rhipsalis floccosa is that it has an extremely long flowering period. Compared to other Rhipsalis, where they do tend to have a large flush over a couple of weeks, Rhipsalis floccosa seems to bloom sporadically for months. This actually started blooming, I want to say maybe it started in the late springish and is still blooming. It's still producing buds. It is, and what's cool about it is that everything is in different stages. So we see the buds, and one thing to point out about the buds here. So you see the wool there, but the thing that you don't see is the actual flower ovary, because it's still inside of the branch. And that is, of course, I've covered in other videos, but again, that is, of course, what it means to be immersed, that the pericarpal is immersed inside of the branch. Luckily, this guy's got a couple of little flowers here. Whee! Even when we hit the flowering stage, you still cannot see the ovary. See how you just cannot see it? It's not there. You only really see the petals of the flower, and that will be the case until the flower actually dies. And even a little while after the flower dies, chances are you're still not going to be able to see the ovary. But I genuinely love Rhipsalis floccosa flowers. So Rhipsalis floccosa flowers they're a little bit larger. Like this is probably about, 2 centimeters in diameter-ish, somewhere around there. You can see the pretty amounts of stamen. I think it depends a little bit on how much light you put these in as to whether or not the flowers will have any kind of coloration on them. I do know that if you were to put this in higher light, you can actually see a little bit of the pink on the back petals here. It will probably produce a stronger pink coloration on the back petals, but they can have slight hints of color. Like I said, some of the subspecies are colored, and this one seems to be a little bit less colored, which Rhipsalis floccosa subspecies floccosa is supposed to have like a greenish white flower. And so that's why I was confused as to whether or not I thought that it was actually subspecies floccosa until I saw the berry, and then I just felt kind of confused. And so that happens. Here you see I love the tufts of wool. Truly, I just think it's fantastic. You can see the flower, and then whenever the flower dies, depending on what stage it's in, here's a really good example. So there's a good example of when a flower has died. You can see that you still don't really see the ovary. Then a little while later, if it's self-fertile or if it was fertilized, and one thing that I have noticed is that if your Rhipsalis are flowering outside, they have a much better chance of producing fruit because chances are bees are fertilizing them. If not, you can go around with a little brush or whatever, but this does seem to be self-fertile because it is readily producing fruits. So the flower has died, and now you can see the ovary because it's like busted its way out, and you see all the little wools around these really cool ovaries. And so these are just unripe berries, and it does take a little while for Rhipsalis berries to ripen. So that's kind of a word of caution, because I feel like a lot of times I see people calling out berries being this color or berries being that color, and they're looking at unripened berries. Usually when a Rhipsalis berry ripens, it is much, much bigger and just very swollen, and the skin will be kind of transparent. Something to keep in mind that these are not final stage berries. So if you were looking at this and you thought, oh, you know, these berries are, depending on how you're looking at it, you could think that these berries are pinkish, reddish, or greenish. At the end, at the tips of these unripened berries, they're kind of a maroon or reddish color. And then underneath, which you can't see it because of the woolly bits surrounding it, you can see it on this one though. You can see that it's green. So it can just take a little while. And sometimes that never happens. Sometimes your berries will just fall off. Sometimes they're not fertilized. You'll see berries and then they will never get there. They will just fall off. Here is what an actual ripe berry looks like. You can see that it is really big, and its first ripe berry was even bigger than this. Here you can see these two together, side by side. That is a very large berry. But you can see how it's swollen. When you squeeze it, it's got like a little bit of, it's not hard, it's got a little bit of give. You can feel that it's swollen. You can kind of see inside, and you can kind of see the dark spots. Isn't that cool? I really, really, really like the berries on this. And I'm like so excited too, because I'm like, oh man, it's got so many. And if they all ripen, it's just going to be like crazy town. We're going to have crazy amount of these big, beautiful white berries. It'll just decorate its own self for the holidays. Yeah, so you can see, like sometimes when these were being described by your botanists or your taxonomists, you might see like funny things in the description, like white or with like a pinkish ring or whatever. That's what they mean by that. So you can see that that kind of maroon color actually ended up in the ripe berry being a pinkish ring at the tip of the berry. And this berry, I would call that white. I think that some people might call that pink. A lot of the Rhipsalis species do that. Start out with berries that are one color. There might be a little bit of maroon on it, and then as it ripens, it will change and become like a vibrant pink. It will just be kind of different. So it's always really interesting. Some people might be wondering how old this plant is. I have absolutely no idea, because I bought this plant and it was already a fairly large size. Out of dumb luck, I just happened to see it. It was not exactly cheap. So I will say, I don't remember how much it was, but my guess is it probably was about $100-ish. I can't pass up a beautiful mature Floccosa like that. I have other Floccosa. They're behind this one. This one has very actively grown. All this here, this is actually new growth from this season. It's done a lot of growing. It wasn't quite this big. It's a really, really impressive plant though. Yeah, I just really like them. So I want to call out what happens though, because of the immersed pericarpal. And I don't think I'm going to be able to see. Oh, there's kind of one that we can look at a little bit. So you see this, you can still see the wool that was just totally immersed way down in there. And then you see kind of a big crater. And that is what will happen to these plants after they have flowered. And so a lot of times you can see plants out on eBay or Etsy or whatever, and you might get lucky and be able to recognize a species based off of something small like that. The berries on it, whether it has wool around its areoles, whether or not it has scarring on the branches. So sometimes you can get really lucky and get really cool things that are actually mislabeled. I've seen all kinds of crazy things labeled as other things. That's why I always kind of say it's a good idea if you like familiarize yourself with small features around the plants that can kind of help you identify them a little bit better and get lucky. And I know that I remember not so long ago, someone had asked me, they said that they were looking for Rhipsalis floccosa for a really long time and couldn't find it. And so in the United States, I've never really seen this commercially available. anywhere, like in terms of like you could walk into a normal store and buy it, or any kind of plant store online. The only places where I've ever seen this sold were eBay or Etsy, and more often than not, it would be eBay. But it does come up every once in a while. Someone sells cuttings, and every once in a while a plant. And that's kind of a good caution, because Rhipsalis floccosa, in my experience, is a little bit harder to root. It is more prone to rotting. It's not like horrible. All Rhipsalis are fairly easy to root, but sometimes when they have like stouter, thicker stems like this, it can be a little bit tougher. So I do want to kind of backtrack on that a little bit. I think that Rhipsalis floccosa that have the thicker branches are a little bit harder to root. I think you really need to kind of let them callus over before you plant them. A lot of the smaller Rhipsalis, you don't have to do that kind of thing with, but these I would highly recommend callusing them. And even then, I've still had some struggles trying to root some of the thicker Rhipsalis floccosa, and most of the Rhipsalis just root like nothing, but Rhipsalis floccosa is just a tiny bit tougher. It's not horrible, you can do it, but it is a tiny little bit tougher. I just love that. Rhipsalis floccosa has always been one of my favorite species, just because I just really, really like the branches and the flowers and the berries and the wool. I like the whole overall morphology of the plant. I just really like everything about it. I do. It's just beautiful. I was always laughing before because if you called Rhipsalis bassifera the spaghetti cactus, this one has to be called the bucatini cactus, because that is really truly what it's like. It's a lot like bucatini. And it's always so hard to do this species justice. When you see it rooting or as a small plant, it's always like meh. But when it's big and beautiful and gorgeous like this, nothing quite comes close to a Rhipsalis floccosa, I think. Just a grand, beautiful one. And actually most Rhipsalis, when they get pretty grand and big, there's not much that can really top that. Rhipsalis are really beautiful. I hope that you've enjoyed looking at Rhipsalis floccosa, subspecies Tucumanensis with me. Thank you for watching. And as always, happy cacti growing.